On Star Trek, it's the captains who collect all the glory. They give the orders, they make the hard decisions, they get the opportunities to ham it up like DeWolf Hopper reciting Casey at the Bat in 1906. But the captains aren't the only people on their ships, nor, more importantly, are they the only characters on their shows. After all, someone has to carry out those orders, support those decisions, and listen to those melodramatic monologues, and more often than not, that someone is the first officer. There have been just as many first officers in the casts of the several Star Trek series as there have been captains. In fact, there have been a few more than that. But who amongst all of those deserves to be called the first among first officers? Or to ask it another way, who is actually Star Trek's number one first officer? Do you like that? Bit of wordplay there with the number one, double meaning. I feel like that sort of complexity and sophistication in the writing of my videos is what sets me apart. That and my restraint, my modesty, my lack of repetitive masturbatory navel-gazing, and my self-awareness. Now then, the first officer, also sometimes called the executive officer, is the second in command. Why is that, by the way? The captain is an officer, and the captain is the one in charge of the ship or space station or whatever it is, so shouldn't the captain be the first officer? Why is the second in command the first officer? And then the third in command is the second officer? That's just confusing. The captain is number one is number two, and the second officer is, I don't know, third base! As depicted in Star Trek, first officer is a tough gig. I'm sure in real life it's a cakewalk, though. The job places often conflicting demands upon the people doing it. A first officer needs to be loyal to the captain, have confidence in the captain's ability and judgment, be able to transfer that confidence to the rest of the crew and inspire them to carry out the captain's orders. But a first officer can't just be a rubber stamp for whatever the captain wants. They need the ability to exercise their own judgment so they can step in and say something when the captain is about to fly the ship into a pulsar and kill everyone because it turns out the captain has been replaced by an alien duplicate. That's another level of skill altogether right there. A good first officer needs to know their captain, so they can tell the difference between when the captain has been replaced, or possessed, or divided into a good half and an evil half, and when the captain is just having a bad morning because the ship's counselor's mother is on the ship again. Again. For some reason. Why is she always here? So like I said, a challenging gig. Technically, the first officer depicted in Star Trek is number one, who serves under Captain Pike aboard the Enterprise in the years prior to Captain Kirk's tenure. But number one first appears in the original pilot, The Cage, which wasn't seen until it was broadcast in altered form as the two-parter The Menagerie in the middle of Star Trek's first season, and wasn't seen in its original form until decades later. So I'll get back to number one when I come to the show on which she is currently a character, Strange New Worlds. For all practical purposes, the first Star Trek character we meet in the position of first officer is Spock, Captain Kirk's first officer aboard the Enterprise on the original Star Trek. I just did a whole video about Spock and how awesome he is. There are a few qualities he has that not only make him a good first officer, but that also establish a template for first officers in subsequent Star Trek shows. For one thing, Spock is a plausible commander of the Enterprise. The first officer of a starship is a little bit like the vice president of the United States. If something happens to the captain, the first officer takes charge of the ship. The first officer also commands the ship whenever the captain is away, so they need to be credible in that role. In Star Trek: The Original Series, we frequently find Spock in command of the Enterprise while Captain Kirk is missing in a parallel dimension, or recovering in sickbay after being stabbed by an Orion disguised as an Andorian, or down on a planet talking a robot into destroying itself, or getting replaced by a robot, or having sex with a robot, or having sex with a woman, or getting replaced by a woman. And Spock always seems to have the situation under control. Like I said earlier, a first officer needs to be loyal to the captain, but their most important duty is to the ship and the crew as a whole. Spock best demonstrates this facet of being a first officer during a brief interlude when the Enterprise is under the command of neither himself nor Captain Kirk. I'm talking about the classic episode from Season 2 of Star Trek the Original Series, The Doomsday Machine. Specifically, I'm talking about the section of the episode where Kirk, along with a small away team that also includes Scotty, is trapped aboard the wreck of the starship Constellation. Meanwhile, back on the Enterprise, Commodore Decker, the former commander of the Constellation, has taken charge as the senior officer on board. Spock continues to function as first officer, determined to confront and destroy the massive planet-destroying doomsday machine that damaged the Constellation and killed his crew. Decker orders the Enterprise to attack. This is a bad idea. The planet killer has already crippled the Constellation, and there's no reason to assume the Enterprise will fare any better against it. Decker's judgment is obviously compromised by his Ahab-like obsession with destroying the planet killer. One of the most important jobs of a first officer is to step in and take command when it looks like the captain is losing it. And when Decker orders an attack course, Dr. McCoy is right there on the bridge, basically jumping up and down for Spock to do just that, relieve Decker and take command of the Enterprise. But Spock knows the rules and regs better than anyone. He can't just relieve Decker because he disagrees with his orders. Decker must show himself to be physically or mentally unfit for command before Spock can throw him out of the big chair. Spock even shoots down McCoy's offer to certify Decker as unfit on the spot because Spock knows McCoy hasn't had a chance to give Decker a proper examination. So what does he do? He stands close by, and he waits, and he watches. The Enterprise moves in close to the planet killer and scores direct phaser hits, but fails to do any damage. The planet killer returns fire and seriously damages the Enterprise. The planet killer grabs the Enterprise in its tractor beam and begins pulling it in for the kill. Spock recommends veering off. Decker refuses, and Spock's like, "That's the kind of talk that'll get you relieved of command." So Decker reluctantly gives the order to veer off. Only by that point, the planet killer has too tight a grip, and the Enterprise can't escape from the tractor beam. Fortunately, by this time, Captain Kirk and Scotty have gotten the Constellation somewhat working, and Kirk is able to free the Enterprise from the tractor beam using the Constellation's phasers. Kirk calls the Enterprise and is surprised to find Decker in command. Kirk's like, "Spock, get that dipshit out of my chair before he gets you all killed. I am ordering you to relieve him of command on my personal authority as captain of the Enterprise." Spock's like, "Good enough for me." And he turns to Decker like, "Are you walking out or are we carrying you?" For me, this incident illustrates the qualities that make Spock a great first officer. He sticks to the rules. He doesn't just do whatever he feels like, but he doesn't allow his commitment to the rules to override his duty to the ship or the crew. He's willing to let Decker, his superior officer, take command of the Enterprise and gives Decker some slack, even though it's apparent to everyone that Decker isn't thinking straight. But when Decker's orders begin to actively endanger the ship, relatively speaking, I mean, there's a gigantic, indestructible plant-eating space cigar right over there, so they're kind of always in danger. Spock steps in, first by reminding Decker that he could be relieved of command if he continues on his present course, and then finally by relieving him once Captain Kirk gives him the order to do so. Then, after Decker has been relieved, Spock commands the Enterprise effectively for most of the rest of the episode, while Kirk remains stranded on the Constellation. Kirk thinks of Spock as the best first officer in the fleet, an opinion apparently shared by others. But that's Kirk. Spock is his first officer and his best friend, so of course Kirk's gonna think that. But Spock's not the only first officer we get to know throughout the rest of the franchise. How does he stack up against his counterparts? When Star Trek The Next Generation debuted in 1987, it introduced us to a new Enterprise, a new captain, and a new first officer, Commander Will Riker. An important part of Riker's duties as first officer aboard the Enterprise D is to lead away teams. This is a new wrinkle. Throughout Star Trek the original series and into the movies, Captain Kirk himself typically took charge of away missions. Spock often went along as well, but he sometimes remained behind to command the ship in the captain's absence. On TNG, it's mostly the opposite of that. Riker nearly always leads the away teams, with Picard only joining the party when his involvement is absolutely necessary. This division of labor works well dramatically, providing the writers of the show with a built-in mechanism for giving more members of the ensemble meaningful roles to play in episodes, and it gives us another criterion by which to evaluate Riker's effectiveness as a first officer. Spock often serves as an advisor to Captain Kirk. Riker doesn't really fill that role with Captain Picard. Frequently, when faced with a crisis, Picard solicits options from his senior officers, and Riker throws his 2 cents in along with everyone else, but he doesn't seem to have the captain's ear any more than anyone else. What Riker is Picard's agent, dispatched out into the world to investigate, evaluate, and carry out the captain's will. Riker's role while aboard the Enterprise incorporates a bit of this captain's agent function as well on TNG, in addition to all the stuff we saw Spock do on TOS and leading away teams. The first officer's responsibilities include managing the crew of the Enterprise, filling out the duty roster, assigning personnel to various departments, and conducting performance reviews and passing along recommendations for promotions and transfers to the captain. Riker is also Picard's liaison to the crew. If someone on the crew needs to talk to the captain about something, they take it to Riker first. The first officer leads the away team conceit was mostly abandoned in the TNG-era movies, since the producers wanted Captain Picard as the lead protagonist to be more of an action-oriented character, but oddly enough, one of the best examples of how well this division of labor between captain and first officer can work comes from one of those movies, specifically Star Trek First Contact. After the Enterprise follows the Borg ship back in time to Earth in the year 2063, Captain Picard decides they should transport to the surface to check out the damage the Borg were able to cause before the Enterprise blew them up. Picard initially leads the landing party, but is soon forced to return to the ship when reports come in indicating that some Borg have survived and are now aboard the Enterprise. So Picard beams back up and leaves Riker in command of the away team, in a situation that would have been typical for an episode of the TV series. While Picard deals with the Borg on the Enterprise, Riker takes charge of the effort on the surface to assist Zefram Cochrane and his ragtag bunch of astrophysicists and aerospace engineers in launching Earth's first ever faster-than-light spaceflight so that human history doesn't run off track. And not only does Riker and his team, which also includes LaForge and Troy, among others, succeed and get that all-important first warp flight off the ground, Riker gets to have some fun, too. He and Geordi serve as Cochrane's crew aboard the warp ship, and, as if that wasn't cool enough, the day before, Riker also gets to stun Cochrane with a phaser to prevent him from fleeing the project. How awesome must that have been? That's like going back in time to the American Revolution, kicking the shit out of George Washington, then getting to be on the boat when he crosses the Delaware. No wonder Riker's always wearing that king shit a fuck mountain grin on his face. He earned it. As for the head of personnel, gateway to the captain part of the job, we see examples of that sprinkled throughout TNG. Riker attempts to impose some discipline on Ensign with a bad attitude Ro Laren when she transfers aboard the Enterprise. He speaks to Captain Picard about concerns others in the crew have about Lieutenant Barclay's performance. We occasionally hear Riker make reference to having to complete performance reviews, usually in tandem with Counselor Troi, which makes it all the more appropriate when, in Season 7's Thine Own Self, Troi randomly decides that she wants to earn a promotion, and Riker must evaluate her. After Troi repeatedly fails to pass a crucial test on the holodeck, Riker tells her that as first officer, his most important duty is to the ship, which gives Troi the clue needed to realize that, in order to pass the test, she has to order Hologram Geordi to his death. Which she does, of course, because who cares? He's a hologram. They don't have rights. They aren't people. Yet. Impressed by Troy's willingness to cold-bloodedly condemn one of her fellow officers to die of radiation exposure, Riker grants her the promotion. A proud moment for him, no doubt. We see Riker leaning into his responsibilities as the captain's gatekeeper in the first half of The Best of Both Worlds, when he sternly reprimands Commander Shelby for talking directly to Captain Picard about her plan for attacking the Borg. Later, when Riker has been promoted to captain after Picard's abduction and assimilation by the Borg, he chooses Shelby to be his first officer, thus demonstrating that he holds no grudge against her for being a little grade-grubbing, apple-polishing suck-up who won't take no for an answer. So that's an important skill for a first officer, too, doing or not doing whatever that was I just said. One of the things that helps to keep Star Trek interesting after so many years and so many shows is that each show approaches things a little differently. Riker's responsibilities as first officer are similar in many ways to Spock's, but not exactly the same. And that's also true for the first officer of the next Trek series, Deep Space Nine. As first officer to Commander and later Captain Ben Sisko, Major Kira's job is broadly similar to Riker's in many ways. She's also stuck with personnel management and logistical duties. But unlike Riker, leading away teams isn't a regular part of the gig for her. Also unlike Riker, Kira's not in Starfleet. She's a member of the Bajoran Militia, a force Starfleet is working with to operate the space station. So while she is the captain's liaison to the rest of the crew, as Riker is for Picard, she's also the representative of the Bajoran Militia's segment of the crew to the captain. Major Kira joins the Bajoran Militia and Starfleet together, like Leland Stanford driving in the Golden Spike to link the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads at Promontory Summit, only with less blood on her hands. Beyond representing her particular uniformed service, Kira also acts as the voice of Bajor and its people as a whole. Because of this, her relationship with Sisko is, while never antagonistic, sometimes contentious, particularly in the early seasons of the series when the social and political happenings related to Bajor are featured more prominently. Which is not to say Kira's dynamic with Sisko is all tension. As the series goes on, they develop a cordial and respectful working relationship that eventually deepens into a true friendship. Plus, Sisko is the emissary of the prophets, a revered figure in the Bajoran religion, of which Kira is a devout follower, meaning that, in a spiritual sense, Kira looks up to Sisko almost as much as Riker looks up to Picard. Kira gets to flex her first officer muscle right away. She takes charge of the station while Sisko is in the wormhole getting to know the prophets in the series pilot episode Emissary. Kira not only commands the successful relocation of the space station so that Bajor can lay claim to the newly discovered wormhole, her idea, she also stands up to a squadron of Cardassian warships. Given Kira's character history, she was a resistance fighter, a terrorist as she often describes herself. Her job as first officer of Deep Space Nine represents a significant career change for her. She's gone from smashing authority to enforcing it. We see that she doesn't always find her bureaucratic duties to be very enjoyable or fulfilling. She questions the purpose and value and sometimes even rightness of the work she's doing. We see this dramatized very effectively in the first season episode Progress, where Kira is tasked with convincing an irascible old farmer to relocate from his home on a Bajaran moon so that it can be tapped as a power source. Characters having to make adjustments when their lives take unexpected turns is a recurring theme on Deep Space Nine. We see it play out again when Worf joins the crew at the start of the show's 4th season and eventually takes on a role not unlike that of a first officer, though never explicitly identified as such. Worf's official job title on Deep Space Nine is Strategic Operations Officer, which sounds like something a CEO would make up to give his nephew a job, but eventually the writers of Deep Space Nine decide that what that means is, when Captain Sisko isn't personally commanding the Defiant, Deep Space Nine's attached starship, Worf is in command. So Kira is Sisko's first officer on the station, and Worf is basically Sisko's first officer on the Defiant. You need another reason why Sisko is the best captain? Dude's such a badass, he needs 2 first officers to handle his shit for him. The video's not about that. I'm just saying. Part of Kira's character development as a first officer is in learning to accept her place within a hierarchy, a system, the sort of system she was violently rebelling against not so long ago. Becoming a first officer, or strategic operations officer, also demands that Worf adjust to a new role with new responsibilities. Unlike Kira, Worf has been a part of a hierarchy for a long time, but until he gets to Deep Space Nine, he's mostly been following orders. Now, when he takes command of the Defiant, it's his job to give them. But the Defiant isn't his ship. He's not the captain. He's just the guy the captain lets drive it. So Worf still represents Sisko when he takes the Defiant out on missions. He still has to carry out the captain's will. That potential source of tension is also present in the next Star Trek series, between Captain Janeway of the USS Voyager and her first officer, Commander Scabkotay. Chakotay. Initially, Chakotay seems set up to do a variation on one of Kira's first officer responsibilities from Deep Space Nine, whereas Kira is a member of a non-Starfleet service that is working in cooperation with Starfleet. Chakotay is a member of the Maquis, a group of rebels who operate against Starfleet. The specific group of Maquis who find themselves aboard Voyager aren't there by choice. They and Janeway's Starfleet crew have all been stranded on the far side of the galaxy together. The Maquis join with the Starfleet crew as a matter of survival, and Chakotay, being both the leader of the Maquis faction and a former Starfleet officer, is selected by Janeway as her first officer, in part to help unify the two crews. Like how Barack Obama chose Joe Biden as his vice president so the old white people wouldn't be too scared to vote for him. The big difference is Biden is pro-union. Usually. So, like Major Kira, Chakotay is the representative for a non-Starfleet segment of the crew, and, like Major Kira, Chakotay has some initial tension with his captain. Janeway and Chakotay eventually become close friends, probably closer than any captain-first officer pairing since Kirk and Spock, really. But that tension, something the writers of the show jettisoned almost immediately because Voyager, does briefly resurface at the end of Voyager's 3rd season and the beginning of its 4th, during the events of the Scorpion two-parter. Faced with a lengthy and dangerous journey across Borg territory, Captain Janeway comes up with a ludicrous plan. Make a deal with the Borg. Help them design a weapon to use against their new enemy, Species 8472, in exchange for safe passage through their space. Chakotay immediately objects to this ludicrous plan on the grounds that it's a ludicrous plan, and also for practical and ethical reasons. Practically speaking, even if they are able to come to some sort of arrangement with the Borg, which no one has ever done before, they have no reason to believe the Borg will keep their end up. Ethically speaking, maybe giving the Borg an ultimate weapon is a bad idea? Because they're the Borg? Captain Janeway is like, those are all very reasonable and thoughtful objections to my plan, but we're doing it anyway. Now, Chakotay is in one of the most difficult spots a first officer can be in. He's got to back the captain up and help to execute a plan that he does not believe in. Things get even trickier for him when Janeway is injured and placed in a medical coma. With her last words to Chakotay, she urges him to maintain their newly formed alliance with the Borg. Chakotay ends the alliance almost immediately, deciding that the demands now being made by the group of Borg aboard Voyager, which includes 7 of 9, are unreasonable and would put the ship in even greater jeopardy. When Janeway wakes up from her coma, she's pissed at Chakotay for disobeying her orders and throwing away the agreement she made with the Borg, but he explains his reasons why and informs Janeway that while she was unconscious, they learned that the Borg were responsible for starting the conflict with species 8472 in the first place. So they get back on the same page and even use their disagreement to their advantage. And eventually it all works out, and they even get a new crew member. Not only does Chakotay disobey the captain's orders, his insubordination is vindicated by the events of the episode. 7 of 9 does double-cross Janeway once the Borg have defeated species 8472 and attempt to take control of Voyager, just as Chakotay predicted when he objected to Janeway's plan in the first place. This reminds us that offering a counterpoint to the captain is one of the most important parts of a first officer's job. Or, as Riker puts it when arguing with Captain Jellicoe in TNG's episode Chain of Command, "As first officer, it is my responsibility to point out any actions that may be mistakes by a commanding officer." Sir? Of course, Chakotay doesn't put that much stank on it when he's talking to Janeway. He just waits until she's unconscious and then does whatever the hell he wants. Clever. Clever little scab. There's one last first officer to consider from the previous era of the franchise before moving on to discuss a few examples from the current generation, and that would be Sub-Commander T'Pol, the first officer of the Starship Enterprise depicted in the series centered on the first Starship Enterprise, titled Enterprise. Later, Star Trek Enterprise, because apparently there was some confusion. Like some of the first officers who preceded her, or followed her, depending on if you're going by a real-world or in-universe chronology, T'Pol stands astride two worlds. As Captain Archer's first officer, she serves him and his Starfleet crew. As a Vulcan, assigned to Enterprise at the insistence of Vulcan High Command, she represents her people and the interests of her government. You know, now that I think about it, almost all of the first officers I've looked at to this point have had some kind of conflicted identity or divided loyalty, haven't they? Spock is half human, half Vulcan. Doesn't really factor into his role as first officer, but it's a very important part of his character. Kira is the non-Starfleet first officer to a Starfleet captain and has her ambivalence over transitioning from freedom fighter to administrator to deal with. Chakotay is a former rebel leader who joins a Starfleet crew along with a bunch of his rebels, and T'Pol is a Vulcan first officer on an almost entirely human Starfleet crew during a time when tensions between Vulcans and humans are pretty high. The only first officer I've talked about so far without any of those issues is Riker. He loves his captain, he loves his crew, he loves his ship, and he loves to blow that bone. Blow, Big Daddy, blow! The relationship between T'Pol and Captain Archer is perhaps the most tense of any first officer and captain we've ever seen as lead characters in a Star Trek show, at least at first. As with Sisko and Kira and Janeway and Chakotay, Archer and T'Pol eventually become close friends. But in the beginning, things between them are, let's say, cautiously cordial at best. Professional, but strained. One big reason for this is Archer's mistrust of T'Pol, something none of the other first officers I've examined so far have had to deal with. Archer doesn't trust T'Pol because he didn't choose her, because she's there at the behest of the Vulcans, and because Archer doesn't trust Vulcans. He blames them for holding back progress in the human space program, one result of which was that Archer's father died before getting to see the advanced warp engine he helped to design put into service. Archer questions T'Pol's loyalties and suspects her motives, wondering if she's serving as a spy for the Vulcan High Command, sending back reports detailing every little mistake the crew of Enterprise makes, giving the Vulcans reasons to pressure Starfleet to cancel the project and call Enterprise back home. None of that is true, and Archer comes around and accepts T'Pol and is able to let go of his long-standing prejudice against Vulcans, but that is something T'Pol has to deal with in the early days of her tenure aboard Enterprise, along with whatever her typical duties as first officer and science officer, because she's that too, might be. T'Pol's loyalty to Enterprise is never really in question. On the rare occasions when she goes against Archer's orders, it's almost always because she's acting in the best interests of the crew and the ship. In the third season episode, Hatchery, T'Pol leads a mutiny against Archer, taking control of Enterprise when the captain begins behaving irresponsibly after imprinting on a collection of Xindi eggs, which is what any good first officer would do. When the captain places the safety of some alien eggs ahead of his ship and crew, you gotta step in. They aren't even your eggs, Jonathan. Evaluating the performance of the various first officers gets more difficult once we jump to the current era of the franchise, mostly because there's really only one character of note who is defined by being a first officer. So, when I say it's more difficult, what I mean is it demands less time and effort. Several characters serve in the role of first officer throughout Star Trek Discovery, though none are really defined by it. Michael Burnham, the lead protagonist of Star Trek Discovery, is first officer of the USS Shenzhou when that series begins, and briefly serves as Saru's first officer aboard the USS Discovery in Season 3. Saru is the first officer of Discovery under Captain Lorca in Season 1, and Captain Pike in Season 2. In Season 3, Saru becomes captain of Discovery, initially chooses Burnham as his first officer, removes her for insubordination about halfway through the season, and then selects Ensign Tilly as his acting first officer. Then, in Season 4, with Burnham having been promoted to captain of Discovery, Saru returns to serve as her first officer. So, not much stability there. And of those characters and tenures as first officer I just mentioned, the only ones that really mean anything are Burnham's initial position as first officer aboard the Shenzhou, because it represents the career track Burnham is on before her attempted mutiny and the Klingon War kinda blows up her life, and Tilly's stint as Saru's acting first officer in Season 3, which allows the insecure, uncertain Tilly to gain self-confidence and to realize the confidence her shipmates have in her. On Star Trek Lower Decks, the first officer of the USS Cerritos is Commander Ransom, a thinly veiled Riker surrogate whose main function on the series, like every other character, is to remind us of stuff from other Star Trek shows. In the third season of Star Trek Picard, Voyager alumnus 7 of 9 has randomly been appointed first officer of the USS Titan under Captain Shaw, after not even being in Starfleet the last time we saw her. In the first episode of the season, she disobeys Shaw's orders and does what Picard wants instead, so the show can happen. Hey, let's talk about number 1 on Strange New Worlds. Like I said earlier, going by production order, number 1 is the first officer in the Star Trek franchise, because she's Captain Pike's first officer in the original TOS pilot episode, The Cage. But in the last couple of years, number 1 has gone from the answer to a trivia question to a full-fledged character thanks to the revival of the Captain Pike era adventures of the Enterprise on Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Though they're meant to be the same person, the number 1 we see on Strange New Worlds differs from the version of herself we see in The Cage, mainly in the fact that she has a personality, which is the most immediately apparent difference between the TOS and Strange New Worlds versions of Nurse Chapel as well. What an astounding and inexplicable coincidence. Number 1, we learn in Strange New Worlds her name is actually Una Chin Riley, which is fine, but redundant. We didn't need to know her name. We knew her name. Her name is number 1. Anyway, number 1 is a very good first officer indeed. She's respected by the crew of the Enterprise. She carries herself with gravitas and authority, which inspires confidence from others. The Picard-Riker style division of labor regarding who leads the away missions isn't present on Strange New Worlds, so sometimes we see Number One taking charge of away missions, and sometimes we see her commanding the Enterprise while Pike is off doing that. When she's on the bridge, we sometimes see Number One working one of the forward stations, something we also saw her doing in the cage. We also see that she has the same personnel-related duties as other first officers. The Short Treks segment Q&A depicts Number One welcoming a newly assigned Ensign Spock to the Enterprise, and Subspace Rhapsody, the musical episode from the recently completed second season of Strange New Worlds, includes Number One mentoring Lieutenant James Kirk, who is about to take up the position of first officer on the USS Farragut. Details like that, Kirk being assigned to shadow Number One before becoming a first officer, imply how respected Number One is at that position. In the second season episode Ad Astra per Aspera, we see it not only implied, but stated outright, as Number One's shipmates from the Enterprise take the stand at her court-martial to testify to what an exemplary officer she is. Competent, sensitive, courageous, selfless, a mentor, a friend, family. Perhaps the most persuasive testimony regarding what a great first officer Number One is comes from the one major character who didn't testify at her court-martial, Captain Pike. The Pike-Number One relationship picks up the captain and first officer are best friends trope first established by Kirk and Spock, and adds a wrinkle of its own. Though Kirk is hardly as aloof as Picard, we get the impression throughout Star Trek the original series that, in terms of personal friendship, he's really only close with Spock and Dr. McCoy. That is definitely not the case with Captain Pike in Strange New Worlds. Pike is shown to be unusually close with his crew. He's a kind of surrogate father figure to Spock, a mentor to Uhura. He has a delightfully playful rapport with Ortegas on the bridge. He regularly hosts dinner parties in his quarters for his officers. But even within that context, Pike seems particularly close to Number One. When Pike takes time away from Starfleet following his mission commanding Discovery, during which he receives the devastating revelation that he is destined to have a disfiguring and debilitating accident in 7 or 8 years, it's the news that Number One has disappeared during a first contact mission that gets Pike back in uniform and back on the Enterprise. Number One is also one of the only people with whom Pike shares his vision of his future, which speaks to how closely Pike trusts her. Number One getting in trouble at the start of Season 1 gets Pike back on the Enterprise, and Number One getting in trouble at the start of Season 2 convinces Pike to leave the Enterprise, travel to a planet in a distant nebula where humans don't breathe so good, and risk his own life to secure the best possible legal counsel for Number One's upcoming court-martial. And of course, once Number One prevails and is reinstated to Starfleet, Pike welcomes her back to the Enterprise with a big hug. Oh, and the reason she was court-martialed to begin with is that Number One, as revealed in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, is an Illyrian, a species that practices genetic modification. And genetic modification is banned in the Federation, which means, by the book, Number One is ineligible to serve in Starfleet. Except she'd already been in Starfleet for decades before anyone found out, and she's, like, the best officer ever. So, once again, we have the conflicted identity caught between two worlds trope regarding a first officer. Damn. Star Trek writers really love that shit, don't they? Not that I blame them. One of the first people to learn about Number One's secret genetically modified heritage is Captain Pike, who vows to fight for her right to remain in Starfleet, a vow which he keeps. Any first officer who inspires that kind of devotion from their captain must be pretty amazing. Well, that's everybody, or everybody I'm going to talk about anyway. Which brings me back to the video's titular question: who is actually Star Trek's Number One first officer? From an in-universe, or Watsonian, perspective, Little tip of the deer stalker to you Sherlockians out there. It's a horse race. If I were the captain of a Starfleet ship, I would want a first officer who could take over if something happened to me, who was a strong and dependable leader, who had the respect of the crew, who was willing and able to offer a different perspective and to challenge me when they thought it appropriate, and who I could count on to have my back. And really, every first officer I've looked at in this video meets that standard. Yes, even you black leg. I don't think that's racist. You scab. Strike rules. What are those? Anyway, all the characters who we know primarily, or at least considerably, as a first officer seem like pretty great first officers, which makes sense. I don't think anyone ever pitched Paramount a Star Trek series with a character list that included something like Commander Smith. She's the ship's first officer, and she's just the worst. That being the case, I think I need a tiebreaker, and for that, I'm going to step outside the Star Trek universe into a Doyleist perspective, if you will. From that perspective, for me at least, the choice becomes more obvious, because while we've met many outstanding characters who have filled the role of first officer in their series, there are really only two who have been almost totally defined by that role, Commander Riker and Number One. Since Number One technically came first, we'll call her Number One, and Riker can be Number One, Number Two. Please don't read into that. Between the two of them, I gotta go with Riker. All due respect to Number One, who has been developed into a fantastic character on Strange New Worlds, and who, from an in-universe perspective, from all indications, is an outstanding first officer, but Riker excels at every requirement to be a great first officer. And for 7 years on Star Trek The Next Generation and 4 feature films, we got to see him doing it. He leads the away teams. He takes command of the ship when Picard is gone and saves the world while doing it. Thanks for that. He's held in high regard by his captain and his crewmates. He doesn't let the fact that he is up for it literally any time with literally anyone interfere with his professional responsibilities. And most of the time we see him, he's rocking the best beard in the galaxy, which should have been your first clue that the fix was in. For my money, Star Trek's number one is number 2. He's the shit. Hey folks, I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Big Wood Farmer. Thanks, Big Wood Farmer. Michael McCluskey. Thanks, Michael. Chris Williamson. Thanks, Chris. Beth Palladino. Thanks, Beth. Neil Blankenship. Thanks, Neil. Ian McGinn, thanks Ian. Kevin Merle, thanks Kevin. Gin and Miskatonics, thanks Gin and Miskatonics. Tim Britton, thanks Tim. Next, new channel members. They are Caitlin L, thanks Caitlin. Angel Cabot, thanks Angel. Robert Wood, thanks Robert. Patrick Kennedy, thanks Patrick. C. Doorman 11, thanks C. Doorman 11. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, to next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic. One of the things Star Trek has always been good at, well, always done, and sometimes been good at, is dramatizing controversial issues. Social issues, political issues, issues that are both of those at once, as issues often are. Next month, we're going to take a closer look at how the franchise has handled one of those issues in particular, as we seek to answer the question, what does Star Trek actually say about euthanasia? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then. So until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching and take care, everybody.